Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an Aberlin Avivo Linguists Online panel called A Queered Science of Language, Contemporary Perspectives. My name is Tyler Kibbey. I'm a research fellow at Humboldt University, Berlin. And joining me today for the panel will be Lal Zimman from the University of California, Santa Barbara, Dominique Canning from the University of Michigan, and Bryce McCleary from Oklahoma State University. Thank you for attending, and the panel will be answering questions collectively at the end of all four talks. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat as we move along, and we will answer them collectively as a panel at the end of the panel lectures. So starting today, my talk, the first talk of the panel, is titled Linguistics Out of the Closet, Comments on a Discipline's Anxiety. The theme of this panel is to look at and question disciplinary and anti-disciplinary trends within linguistics and how that speaks to and allows for, in some cases, a queer linguistics. So for my talk today, I'm going to be focusing less on the queer language science and more the queered science of language. So first, to explain the metaphor and sort of kill the joke, for those of you who might not be familiar with the idioms, to come out of the closet is an idiomatic expression that means to tell your family, friends, or the public that you are gay, or that you're a member of the LGBTQ community, that you have a non-cis heteronormative identity, and it has the connotation that it has up until that point been a secret. And then a skeleton in the closet is something that is discreditable or embarrassing that someone wishes to keep secret. So the point of this talk is to talk about how when we're coming out of the closet in linguistics, when we're bringing linguistics out of the closet, that we should also use that opportunity to bring some of the skeletons in the closet with us, which is to say, to bring to light some of the harms and some of the problematic aspects of linguistics as a discipline, as we're trying to build space for our own identities and our own subjects of research within linguistics. So a queered science of language, what are we exactly talking about when we're talking about queering a science of language? And what does it actually mean to have a science of language? Is linguistics a science? Is it a humanities? Is it moral? Is it natural? Well, Leonard Bloomfield, who is considered one of the founding members of American linguistics, in 1925 was writing in defense of the formation of the Linguistic Society of America. At the time, linguistics was, by its very nature, interdisciplinary. Most linguists at the time were based in other departments in various universities of the United States, at least in the American context. For Bloomfield, he argued that it was a human or moral science, that it was fundamentally about a social institution, but at the same time, it was at the foot of the natural sciences. Bloomfield considered linguistics, second only to psychology, to be the connection between the natural and the moral sciences, which is to say between the social sciences or the soft sciences and the hard sciences. He argued that in its methodology, linguistics was almost completely in line with the natural sciences in terms of its empirical research, but in its subjective research, or the object of its research, that being language as a social institution, which he understood as being affected by the flow of history and by human sociality, he considered that to be one of the central aspects of linguistics that kept it rooted in the humanities as opposed to natural science. But this leads to a certain disciplinary anxiety that we see throughout the field. It's hard to classify to certain scholars if you're going outside the discipline. Are you a scientist? Are you working in the humanities? Is it a social science, a natural science? In the United States, for instance, depending on what type of funding you're looking for, linguistics technically counts as a STEM field. Depending on what area you're working within one of the subfields, it could be a humanities, or it could be a philosophy or a social science. And this disciplinary anxiety is not new to science in any sense, or to linguistics specifically. we see a similar trend in, for instance, with anatomy. So the move from the lecture by analogy. So during the, for instance, the Roman era, you have the Roman medic Galen, who would lecture on anatomy based on analogy to animals, since human autopsies were forbidden at the time. But as we move to human biopsies and we create this huge science, this disciplinary theater, in this case, the theater of the autopsy as seen in this depiction at the right, we get this anxiety between what a discipline was and what it has become, between the living human body in the time of Galen, as opposed to the reified body of the corpse in the time of the autopsy theater. Similar comparisons have been made to Ferdinand de Saussure's move to reify the linguistic sign as a synchronic object and taking it out of its diachronic context. Some observations that were made by his early contemporaries, such as Valentin Voloshinov, the Russian linguist who is contemporary to Bakhtin. Now, what disciplinary anxiety means for us here when we're talking about a queered language science or a queered science of language is that an anxiety with the status of the discipline as an institution, that same pressure that attempts to keep queer and translinguistics in the closet, and how that same pressure also tries to keep the skeletons of the discipline in the closet, keeps the secrets that the discipline would otherwise not want to come to light in hiding. I want to give one example, one very small example, an oversimplified example, I would like to stress that, of the relationship between this disciplinary anxiety and certain skeletons in the closet, and how the construction of a discipline works to keep those skeletons in the closet. So first, I want to look at Christian imperialism and linguistics as an example of that anxiety-inducing disciplinary skeleton. And a really interesting historical context for looking at this is the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Islands, in which we only need to look at 4 individuals to see just the beginning of a very complex network of disciplinary systems that work together to keep certain colonial and imperial skeletons in the disciplinary closet. So first we have Sir William Jones, the 18th century British judge in Williams, Calcutta, and also a well-known philologist, perhaps best well-known for his observations about Sanskrit being related to Greek and Latin. And for that observation, he gets to be included most often within linguistics as a discipline, as one of its forefathers per se. He observes that the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek and more copious than the Latin. Very similar in terms of time frame and or time period and location. We have one of the first foreign missionaries from America, Adonoram Judson, who does not get to be included in the linguistic literature because he was a missionary, an American missionary especially. But as a missionary, he was one of the first to establish a long-term project of translating the Bible into an East Asian language, specifically Burmese. He's also credited with creating one of the first English-Burmese dictionaries and grammars that is still often referenced and used in the study of that language today. Going to the Andaman Islands, we have the British administrative officer Maurice Val Portman, who was a self-described anthropologist, but whose work mostly focused on the linguistics of the Andamanese languages. He is perhaps most infamously known for the manner in which he collected linguistic data, which has led many linguists, including Bernard Crumb's fantastic work, to move away from placing him within the linguistic canon, because he would often collect his linguistic data from the indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands through torture or some other forms of physical manipulation. And for that reason, even though he is our primary source for much of our rather contemporary linguistic data for the Andamanese languages, he is often excluded from linguistics as a discipline. And then we have John Allen Chow, who was a missionary who died in 2018, attempting to contact the quote unquote uncontacted peoples of North Sentinel Island. And for him, actually, he had formal training in linguistics, even though he was principally acting as a missionary, and in fact makes some of the only extant observations about the phonetic structure of the Sentinelese language. Now, if we're thinking about this in terms of just the individuals, we also need to look at the administrative and financial frameworks that supported them. In this case, if we're looking at these individuals as primarily being affiliated with religious institutions or colonial and imperial institutions, we can see that between missionary societies, colonial societies, and different auxiliary societies that support missionary work, just with these four individuals, we can see at least $12 million in today's currency of the currently 1.2 trillion American faith sector, not even considering non-American faith nonprofits that are working across the globe. We see that American missionary linguistics, which is traditionally, most people would not consider linguistics because of its sort of disreputable imperial, colonial, and evangelical past, and the way in which that missionary linguists have traditionally conducted themselves, and sort of their nebulous goals and the questions of whether it's empirical, setting that aside for a moment. We see that there's actually a very complex network, financial and administrative network across time and across several centuries and different empires that contributes to propping up this system. But if we're thinking about it in terms of a language science, we get a very different picture of what we consider to be language science, at least what did in the canon, either through policing or through explicit references within a bibliography, within textbooks, within certain courses. What linguists and what language scientists consider to be language science largely excludes the majority of language research that goes on in the world, simply because that research isn't in line with certain scientific ideals about what empirical research looks like. And so here we see a much more greatly reduced version of what language science might be. And here we see Sir William Jones is still included, but very tenuously through his contributions to the Journal of the Asiatic Society, which he helped found. Now, if we look at what a linguistic discipline is in comparison to the science, from that same chart, looking at an American context, we get a much smaller picture. In this case, we only see out of all these different institutions and people that were working together or working alongside each other over 3 or 4 centuries, instead of seeing this large network of sometimes infamous, sometimes relatively unknown individuals working on different projects with different goals related to language science and the study of language, we see only a national context and a societal context, that being the Linguistic Society of America. And so what antidisciplinarity means when we're looking at this one particular closet and this one particular set of skeletons, and how we translate that to the discipline as a whole, is that we really need to be looking at 4 different objectives within antidisciplinary work. The first being that we need to just start by confronting the complex history of language science that exists beyond the discipline, which is to say the discipline as an institution, as a legitimized institution by the scientists, in this case, the linguists that make up that disciplinary institution. We also, going back to Bloomfield, when he originally formulated the discipline in his defense, he took the Linguistic Society of America in the American context to be the milestone for linguistics as a discipline and not just as a science. But much in the way that linguistics existed in the American context before Bloomfield and before the establishment of the Linguistic Society of America, if we want to be doing anti-disciplinary and very forward-facing research in terms of our moral responsibilities, we need to begin re-embracing that contradiction of linguistics as a moral and a natural science, even though that is largely detrimental to linguistics as a discipline. It hopefully will prove beneficial to linguistics as a science. A third step, which is simply working towards administrative excellence, which is a bit of a technical note that I'll just then again, working to hold each other to account and avoiding one-dimensional thinking, which is in many ways what we're trying to do here by presenting a range of contemporary perspectives and demonstrating different ways to approach anti-disciplinary thinking and moving beyond the linguistic discipline as a disciplinary institution. So the first, I'm not sure who is going to get this Diogenes, the cynic joke. If you do get the joke, that's fantastic. I'll be your greatest fan for life. If not, you can take my word for it. It's hilarious. But for the first step is simply challenging and confronting that complicated history. And by challenging that history, what we're really talking about is challenging heteroshistoriographies of language science. And that doesn't simply mean, as heteroshistoriography, that doesn't simply mean the creation of history in a way that elides the fact that Socrates was incredibly homoerotic in all of Plato's renditions of him in the stories. It's not a matter of eliding the history of queer or non-heteronormative individuals throughout human history. By challenging heteroshistoriography, it's a call to move beyond just challenging erasure and reacting to erasure. And so what we really want to do when we challenge linguistic heteroshistoriography is to work towards a history of our science that moves beyond just undoing the harms. It actually moves to recognize how the discipline has been harmful and move to correct it. So an example of this is the bibliography, or just the way that we create the discipline through our own writing. So here we have two different pictures, a very famous example of different perspectives. On the left, we have a Renaissance rendition of Judith killing her captor Holofernes in the Old Testament story by a woman artist. And on the right, we have a depiction of the same act, but this time painted by a male artist. And what we see is that even though it's telling the same story, just like our bibliographies are typically demonstrating the same portrayal of a discipline as an institution, as a body of collective work and knowledge, we see that there's a very stark difference between simple history and hagiography, which is to say the sort of sanctification of certain individuals as the precursors or the gatekeepers to a true linguistic science. And what that means isn't just confronting it and saying, there's more than just Bloomfield. And of course, there's more than just Bloomfield. It's moving beyond it to say, okay, the absence of a reaction to Bloomfield. What might linguistic science look like if instead of a explicitly heterosexual body of researchers really working together in the early 20th century to create the discipline of linguistics? What might that look like if it was primarily trans researchers that were creating linguistics as a discipline? What might it mean for a linguistic discipline that comes out of non-Western traditions? It's not simply reacting to a body of literature, it's reanalyzing or trying to approach from a different perspective why that literature is the way it is and how are we perpetuating its own structure through our own work and our own disciplinary maintenance. Second, we need to be not just thinking about the discipline as an institution, but the discipline as an institution that holds a certain trust, in this case being the public trust. Often that has been held up, that disciplinary structure, that skeleton in the closet calls to descriptive science, which is an idea that linguistic science is empirical, just as Bloomfield suggested in this methodology. And that because it is purely a natural scientific methodology, it must be purely descriptive, as opposed to prescriptive. And in this case, we end up with the dichotomy that primacy to the natural scientific aspects of linguistics while completely ignoring the moral scientific aspect. For transcriptive thinking instead of simply descriptive thinking, we need to move back from simply the application of linguistic science to a philosophy of linguistic science, which is a question of why are we doing this, not just how are we doing this. A really common example of this is certain linguists talking about how their personal convictions about gender neutral or non-binary pronoun usage diverges somehow from empirical descriptions of that same pronoun usage. So here, one well-known quote from a linguist in the American context, in the intellectual context, saying, telling me I am required for political reasons to use a construction that strikes me as ungrammatical, and judging me morally and politically for not instantly obeying is the most extreme manifestation of prescriptivist Stalinism I have ever encountered. Of course, if we're looking at it through a purely descriptive lens, that would be an entirely appropriate response. But we know that it's not an appropriate response. We know that there's more than just a hardline descriptive empiricism to language, because it is not simply a natural science, but it's a combination, a complex combination of the natural and the moral sciences. Third, and this is the point that I said that was a bit technical that I would try to elaborate a little further once we got to it, disciplinary decentralization. And this aspect of how we can queer a science of language is what many contemporary scientists would consider unfair. It has to do with the administrative and financial structures of certain institutions. So currently, most administrative and financial institutions for academia, for societies, and for research and science in general, for any sort of academic enterprise in the day and age, we see highly centralized institutions in principle, which is to say that a very small body of people or a single person has the ultimate administrative and financial authority over an institution. And this works really well for academics within our own internal gift economies when we have very small numbers of people. And so this works, for instance, for the Linguistic Society of America, first founded because it only had 200 people. And now on the right, you'll see a description of the Linguistic Society of America's contemporary internal structure. And you see that at a certain point, we become more globalized as a discipline, as we become better able to communicate with each other and able to undertake more complex work. That central is a lot more difficult to maintain. So a step in the right direction is to simply decentralize our disciplinary institutions, which is to say, to redistribute the rights, authorities, and financial powers from a single body of people into multiple bodies of people, better able to undertake more well-defined and special actions. Actually, in a case in point, from the earlier example, and the earlier, I didn't mention him explicitly, W.C. Townsend, who was the founder in the 20th century of SIL and Wycliffe Bible translators and all of these other institutions, put this into effect really quite well. And even though he was more or less contemporary with the founding of the Linguistics, his decentralized institutions of missionary linguistics have generated 1,000% more in terms of their income and what they contribute yearly in terms of their net worth. So currently, the institutions he founded for missionary linguistics are running at about a net worth of a combined net worth of $15 million a year. And then the final stage is something that we've seen emerge naturally within science, something that we've lost control of as scientists, and that would be a true administrative and financial distribution. On the right, you can see one of many quote unquote maps of science through the analysis of journal articles and interdisciplinary journal articles. Now, what makes this something that we should work towards, but also something that we need to get a hold of, is that more and more we're seeing, especially beginning around the same time as the foundation of the Linguistic Society of America, a shift in the center, the administrative and financial center of the academy, which, even though these highly decentralized and distributed systems would be preferential for queering science, for taking back control of science, and for addressing some of the harms that our sciences have caused to society and to the world as a whole. No matter how well-intentioned we are as academics, we also have to confront the fact that the academic is no longer the locus of authority within the academic institution, that being now the administrator. What I hope, and what I hopefully have shown here is that the society which is to say the connection between various groups of like-minded individuals and scientists working not for profit during can be highly beneficial for taking back control of our distributed disciplinary interactions. Because in the modern day and age, the academic is no longer in control of the academy. The academy is, as an institution, something that no longer sees the ideal scholar as being a maintenance situation. And finally, building from that, we see a call for systematic professionalism. And what that means is that whether it's antidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multi-polydisciplinary, we need to, as professionals, not just as this idealized scholar, working alone in a room somewhere, writing papers and reviewing abstracts, but as a disciplinary professional, systematically working together to create a better discipline and not just a better science. We need to move towards a science and a discipline. You know, if we want to burn it down, as some people have suggested over recent years, if we want to completely reorganize it, if we want to seek to reach social and moral ills that it has contributed to society as a whole, whatever way we move forward with those actions, we need to confront the institutions that the academy or our science and discipline preserve. In the case of the earlier example, we see linguistics as a place within which empire and colony and Christian imperialism can be preserved quite effectively over many, many centuries, even at the same time when our own science within the discipline has administratively and financially suffered during that same amount of time. Now, Leonard Bloomfield, to return to that same paper in 1925, when he was thinking about what a discipline might look like in the American context, he ends with a call for professional obligation, which is to say that our science, principally and especially because it is more closely, but works through a uniquely human social function, that being language. He ended the paper, he ended his argument for a defense of the discipline with the obligation for the discipline to work for the public's benefit. And when we construct a discipline, when we work in this, we undertake implicitly or explicitly this disciplinary maintenance, putting things in the closet, saying that we can't address it or we shouldn't address it because they're not linguists, even though they did language science, or because, well, they're linguists, but they're doing something wrong, and so we don't want to count them. We run of that obligation that we have to society, but we also abdicate our moral responsibility to other analysts and accounting for each other's actions, but also accounting for our disciplinary actions as a whole. So to end, queering a science of language, it's complex, it's administrative. It works for queer people and hopefully is inclusive of queer people, but it's something that shouldn't be unique to a queer sociality of the science of language. A queer language science is a step in the right direction for bringing to light some of the skeletons that we have in the closet, to dragging them out of the closet with us as we're coming out with a queer linguistics or a trans linguistics. But the way in which we undertake that together cannot be simply reductive to a small community, lest we run the risk of preserving some immoral institutions within our discipline to the benefit of those institutions that have greatly benefited our community the most. So what does it mean to come out of the closet with the skeletons in tow? Coming out of the closet for linguistics is to challenge, again, those heterohistoriographical productions of discipline that tend towards obscuring and advocating responsibility for the complex tradition that has perpetuated colonial imperialism, oppression, and has benefited those relics of those systems of oppression the most. But also when we're talking about skeletons in the closet, we're talking about not just something that we don't want to talk about, but also the untenability of this. Discipline can only exist by having a closet to put things that don't belong to the discipline or shouldn't or can't fit in with the discipline within a contemporary stage. And I'd like to end off by saying that as we're working together, anti-disciplinarity isn't simply a theoretical approach to approach science. It's a personal framework. It's not just the way that we approach the science, but it's the way that we approach coming to the lab to undertake the science. It's a way in which we formulate our scientific question, in which we ask ourselves, why am I a linguist and what am I doing with linguistics? A question that the panelists coming after me will address in greater detail. Thank you. Next, we will hear from Lal Zimman, who will be presenting on translinguistics.
Great. So let me just go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. So thank you, Tyler, for organizing this panel and inviting me, and thank you to Arbor for bringing this topic into a space where people can discuss some of these really important issues. Today I'm going to be talking about a concept that I've been working on for some time that I call translinguistics, and we can just go ahead and dive into that. So I did want to provide a little bit of background on the place of trans people in queer linguistics. So queer linguistics, when it was kind of first developed in the early 90s, functioned both as a critique of heterosexism and a critique on colonial perspectives related to gender and sexuality in its global context. And importantly, queer linguists were very keen to incorporate both gender and sexual non-normativity into their research in queer linguistics. Sometimes that involved studying communities that might be described or describe themselves as trans, transgender, transsexual. Other authors have been very clear in saying, you know, these categories are not trans, there's something distinct from that category. So today I want to argue that queer linguistics really doesn't provide all of the necessary tools we need to study gender non-normativity, and that translinguistics provides a unique set of insights on language that are valuable to the field. And importantly, this is not, translinguistics doesn't function as a replacement for queer linguistics, doesn't necessarily function as a sub-area within queer linguistics, but as something that kind of evolves along parallel tracks, having a relationship but not being one and the same. And then finally, transphobia, both in our discipline as linguists and in the world more broadly, creates a moral imperative for linguists to engage with trans identities, communities, individuals, and language use. And unfortunately, I won't have time to really talk in depth about transphobia in the discipline, but I hope that that's something that we can discuss in the discussion section. I'm going to start out just by giving a little bit of background on the development of queer linguistics and translinguistics, and I'm going to focus specifically on two closely related areas of research that I've worked on within translinguistics. So one of these is going to be the discursive construction of biological sex, and the other is about vocal sex or gender, how we attribute gender or sex to voices. I'll give you kind of an overview of how I understand translinguistics and its central insights. As I said, I really want to highlight, even though I won't be able to go into it as much, how we need to be thinking about these things not only for academic reasons, but to think about things like, how does our field theorize language? How do we treat our trans students and colleagues? And perhaps on the biggest level, how do we attract trans scholars to the field of linguistics, given that trans people have so much to add to conversations about language? In terms of characterizing queer and trans linguistics, it is important to remember that queer linguistics wasn't just about sexuality, and the fact that they were incorporating gender and sexual non-normativity into one area of study was itself revolutionary. It was something that had also developed in queer theory, and so this was sort of mirroring that development of pushing people to see the connections between gender and sexuality. A lot of queer linguists, particularly in the 1990s, were also linguistic anthropologists, and that further blurred the line between gender and sexuality. So some queer linguists used Western English terminology like trans or gay. Other linguists used only local terms and may or may not have tried to sort of translate those local terms into something that the imagined reading audience might recognize. And I've just given some examples of folks who have studied communities like Hijras in India, Yandaru in Nigeria, Fakaleti in Tonga, and the difficulty in trying to pin down how gender and sexuality separately contribute to their experience. Instead, those things are really close together. But there were a number of problems in this literature. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of those issues were. So some of the shortcomings of trans research in, I should say, early queer linguistics, and I've mentioned some examples here, ran up against a number of issues. So one of these was what the word trans even means, or who the word trans applies to. And I would say that this is complicated in any social context, but it's particularly complicated when we're talking about cultural translation. So when comparing non-English speaking really, or you know, sort of colonial contexts that have been investigated with respect to gender alterity, often there's a contrast made between trans people who in this literature were often characterized as wanting genital surgery or wanting to be perceived as women, since trans feminine people were the focus of virtually all this early research in translinguistics. As you may or may not know, this is not really how trans communities in the US or other parts of the global north tend to understand themselves. So many trans people aren't interested in genital surgery. Many trans people are not interested in passing as cisgender. And so to say, well, this group is not trans because they don't want genital surgery is really to misunderstand what trans can mean in the cultural context where that word is used. Another problem that came up is who the authors were imagining their audience to be. And it's very clear in perhaps particularly the pieces that I'm citing on this slide, that the imagined audience is cisgender people, and not a lot of thought has been put into the possibility that a trans person might be reading this research. So for example, White has an article about a single trans woman and her use of gendered language at work. And he explains that he uses she pronouns for this individual. Those are her correct pronouns, but this is something that the author saw as needing justification and explanation. And he even mentions that readers may be uncomfortable, as he put it, with the choice to use the correct pronouns for this trans woman. There isn't any recognition of the discomfort that trans readers might experience. We can also see that trans people serve kind of a particular function in early queer linguistic research. So they're objects of study and often they're tools for theory. So ways of testing gender theory that were developed by and for cis people. They're not framed as collaborators, as experts to learn from, or even as marginalized and oppressed individuals who are deserving of our protection. And then related to this are the last two issues that shows up in much of this early queer linguistic research. First, who's doing the research? So I think it would be safe to say that the majority of early queer linguists were queer identified themselves. But as far as I know, nobody writing in this writing on this subject in linguistics was openly trans prior to the time that I joined the field around 2003, 2004. Happily, that's changed quite a bit. The last point that's important contrast to draw has to do with the interpretive lens being used. And in a lot of this early queer linguistic research on trans people, there was still not really a trans perspective offered. So let me just give you some quick examples of this. So often this early research would focus on the question of legitimacy and authenticity of trans people's genders. So White, who I just mentioned, looks at stereotype gendered language in this one trans woman's talk at work and describes her as distinctly unladylike and failing to maintain the illusion of femininity, as he put it, because she doesn't use exclusively quote unquote feminine speech characteristics while she's at work, which she works as a salesperson as well. So that's also relevant. Moriel, in another article from the same year, puts a lot of focus on the fact that in her view, trans women, like the person she was writing about, an Israeli pop star named Dana International, will never achieve the status of what she calls real women, a real woman. And both of these authors also share a lot of details about their participants' bodies that are arguably totally unnecessary to share in a linguistics article. A couple of other examples that really highlight the issue of interpretive frame. So Livia's book, Pronoun and Envy, was one of the first major treatments of trans language specifically. But the way she talks about trans identities is fairly transparently delegitimizing. So she says that trans identities are a belief or an insistence or a claim, and we don't see these words being applied to cisgender people, even though we could imagine, for instance, a cisgender man who's a drag queen, we could say that this individual insists that they are a man, but that's not what shows up in the language in this book. In one particular case that I think is really illuminating has to do with the use of grammatical gender in an autobiography that Livia analyzes by a French trans woman, Georgine Noël. And she specifically focuses on cases where Noël doesn't follow what Livia considers to be the expected pattern. So the expected pattern is that Noël would use masculine forms to talk about her life before she transitioned, and feminine forms to talk about her life afterwards. So for example, Noël refers to herself in the feminine when talking about herself as in her childhood, because she was experiencing romantic feelings. Well, I guess I shouldn't say because, when she was describing the romantic feelings she had for a young man. Livia's interpretation of this is that Noël is homophobic, that she is uncomfortable with being characterized as gay, and therefore kind of positions herself as feminine or female in order to talk about this attraction. I think a translinguistic interpretive lens would produce quite different results here. And specifically, we might be pointed to the fact that gender is a really important part of erotic relationships and erotic desire. And many trans people talk about having different experiences with sexuality depending on what gender they're perceived to be by the person that they're engaging with. So this is a case where, in all likelihood, the lived experience of researchers points us in different directions and toward different interpretations. A final point from Livia, where she talks about women as people who are on the losing side of the gender binary, and contrasts that with male to female transsexuals, so not women, they're not given that title, as individuals who are invisible to that binary. And another way in which translinguistics has really set out a distinctive perspective is in recognizing the multiple axes by which trans people experience marginalization and oppression, such that trans women experience both transphobia and misogyny, rather than being exempt from misogyny, which is what Livia sort of implied here. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like to talk about these two closely related subjects of biological sex and vocal sex or gender. So biological sex is, as we would like to define it, will be a socially constructed system for categorizing bodies. That's not always an immediately intuitive way of thinking about biological sex. So it might help to kind of list some of the ways that we can see this construction happening. So to begin with, the fact that biological sex is often constructed as a binary, that's our first piece of evidence that social construction is happening here, since we know that in fact, there are many more than two types of sexed bodies. And people might even be aware of the fact that there are exceptions to the binary, but those exceptions are erased in everyday discussions and constructions of biological sex. Biological sex is also often constructed as a natural phenomenon, as a universal phenomenon, at least for humans and many other species, as this sort of undeniable objective fact about bodies. Another form of erasure that we see, though, is an erasure of variation within sex categories. So not acknowledging the fact that, for instance, some people who are assigned female at birth and who identify as women are going to be, say, taller or more muscular or have more body hair than other people in that same sex category. So when we say that sex is biological sex is socially constructed, all we're saying is that the way we categorize bodies is not derived directly from, nature, not derived directly from nature or biology. It also means that there is more than one way to think about sex. If sex is constructed, then it can be reconstructed in a variety of ways. We're not saying, though, that sex isn't real, that there's no such thing as biological difference, or that bodies don't matter. The idea is that while bodies have a kind of fleshy reality to them, we never have unmitigated access to that meaning, because our perception of bodies is always filtered through a social and historical lens. So one question regarding biological sex would be how trans bodies fit into this picture. And so this is what I'll discuss briefly. So in addition to the fact that only two categories are recognized, it's also the case that different cultures understand the sexed body in different ways. There might be different numbers of recognized categories, two or more than two, or perhaps one. There's also variation in how intersex bodies are seen. Some cultural contexts, you'll find people being assigned to a separate category, and then in other cases, you'll have people being sort of subsumed into one of the binary categories. There's also the fact that bodies can change, and some of these changes are quite dramatic, others less so. Some of them are recognized as dramatic changes. So for instance, if you're trans and you have some form of surgery or you take hormones, that's going to be recognized as a form of bodily change. But of course, there are many other ways that biological sex characteristics change, things like hormonal birth control, pregnancy, menopause. All of these things affect changes in the sexed body. It's also important to recognize that historically the two-sex system is actually a relatively new one, and that previously, historian Thomas LaCour talks about how previously female and male bodies were seen as being on a continuum. And it was a messed up continuum. The idea was that women were less developed versions of men. So we certainly don't want to endorse that model of sex, but it shows us that there are different ways of thinking about sex, not just one way. And then finally, we want to recognize that the sex is not a single characteristic. It's a set of numerous characteristics that are expected to align in particular ways, but don't always align in those expectations, with those expectations. Okay, so within trans communities, there's an important kind of phenomenon that I want to talk about briefly with respect to the discursive construction of sex. So non-trans people, cisgender people, I would say are increasingly recognizing that gender identity is a matter of self-identification. The individual is the person who is best qualified to know what their gender is. Sex, on the other hand, is not usually seen in this way outside of trans communities. But within many, not all, trans communities, sex is also seen as self-identified. So if you were to ask members of these communities, what does it mean to have a male body? People might say it means that you're male identified, and a male body is just the body of a male identified person, regardless of what kind of physical form it might take. So I did a little bit of work, as I mentioned, in online communities for trans men specifically. And in this community, very few people had had genital surgery. And yet there were some really interesting patterns in how their surgically unmodified genitals were referred to. So the most common strategy was to use canonically male terminology. So things like dick, cock. Usually it was kind of vernacular terms rather than scientific ones. Canonically female forms do show up, but only in particular kinds of contexts, including talking about kind of technical or medical information, talking about discomfort with one's body or dysphoria with one's body, or when talking about sexual experiences. So the overall point that I want to make here is that within these communities, any genital terminology is available to speakers if it helps them to express their identity, regardless of the particularities of their body. So this alternative way of understanding sex is really important when we're thinking about something like vocal sex or gender. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about that and to consider or to invite us to consider a few questions. So how can we reimagine phonetics and sociophonetics as trans-inclusive and affirming areas of study? What can phoneticians and sociophoneticians learn from the study of trans voices? What are some ways we can do better at analyzing trans voices? And how can our theories of gender work for all voices? We won't be able to consider all these in the coming few minutes that I have, but we can definitely come back to some of these questions that I don't really get a chance to touch on when we do our discussion. Okay. So it's worth mentioning briefly some of the evidence that vocal sex and gender itself is constructed and is not just a biological reality as it's often treated in linguistic literature. So a few pieces of evidence. One is that different languages and different cultures have different norms for women's and men's voices, even when it comes to something like pitch or fundamental frequency, which is important, of course, because that's the most clearly biologically tied characteristic in the voice. We also know that children learn to produce gendered speech before any differentiation occurs in their vocal tract. So whatever physiological differences exist in adolescent and adult vocal tracts, that's not necessarily where all of the gender variation we observe is coming from if people are doing this from a young age. And then there's also a great deal of variation in the gendered voice among speakers of the same language who are the same gender as well. So we have evidence looking at class, looking at sexuality, looking at race, and showing that gendered phonetic patterns don't hold equally for all women and all men. Surprise. So I want to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the study of trans voices and point to some examples of things, kind of insights that that I've come across in the process of working with trans people and analyzing their voices. So the first lesson, which is a big one, is that we have not sufficiently, as a field, theorized the concept of vocal sex or gender. Basically, nothing has changed in the way that we talk about this concept in the last 30 plus years. So we're still talking about male and female voices. We're still talking about them as a binary. We're still talking about them as a biological phenomenon. Our theories of gender have not had the kind of impact we might want on this concept of vocal sex or gender. So the traditional method for researchers was to observe a speaker, to classify that speaker's sex based on the perceptions of the researcher, and then say, okay, well, I classified this person's sex as female. That means that their voice is also female. Some of the questions introduced by trans voices, okay, well, so we might be comfortable classifying voices as female or male, but what are we actually doing? What does this mean? Most often I found the definition of, the sort of implicit definition of a female voice is the voice of a female person, which has an interesting parallel to the definition of biological sex we were just talking about. The question then, though, is what counts as a female person? And alternatives aren't necessarily a lot better. So we could say, I mean, the issue here is if a female voice is the voice of a female person, that doesn't really tell us anything about those vocal characteristics. It means any type of voice that a female person produces counts as a female voice. And so it doesn't really give us a lot of information linguistically. And it means that people who may not be perceived as female still have female voices. On the other hand, if we use perception, we might say a female voice is a voice that's perceived as female. And certainly that brings up the question, by whom, right? But it also isn't necessarily that much better. So if we say someone who's perceived as female has a female voice, that means there are a lot of cisgender women who don't have female voices because their voices are not perceived as such. So it's tricky. Another question is, do all speakers have either a female or male voice? Are there speakers that have non-binary voices or gender neutral voices, or just outside of this system, ungendered voices? That's something that we haven't really considered. And then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, we have this concept of vocal sex and gender. How do we know whether a given speaker's voice is female or male? And does having a female or male voice always correspond with having a female or male body or identity? A question that has not really been considered in the literature that I would really like to see people develop is what happens, right? What kind of process takes place when someone encounters a voice or a body or an identity that isn't easily classified within a normative binary? And we know very little about that. So this is something not only for us to be thinking about, as a field, but in particular thinking about how the next generation of scholars is going to push us further to consider these issues in new ways. Another lesson that we get is that the body is important, but that the body is both social and malleable. We made this point about biological sex, but it's also true for the voice. So some of my work has looked at changes in F0 among transmasculine speakers, where everybody experienced some significant lowering of fundamental frequency during their first year on hormones, often into a kind of normative male range based on what's reported for American English. But for these speakers, it's really difficult to say which elements are due to physiological change and which elements might be due to social changes, or simply getting used to using a broader pitch range that includes lower pitch points in it. And of course, the choice to go on hormones is itself a social one, as is choosing not to take hormones, meaning that everyone watching this has made a choice about whether or not to make use of hormones. Despite what we can see from these voices in terms of them lowering into a normative male range for F0, do they have male voices? At what point do they become male? Did they switch from female to male? Were they always male? These are things that we don't really know. So it's important to remember that trans speakers are not the only ones with socially constructed bodies, and that all of us engage in social practices that shape our bodies and shape our voices in a variety of ways. Unfortunately, we still know very little about how sexual diversity impacts the gendered voice. And then the point that I want to make next is that vocal sex and gender are not a single unitary trait. And we can see this, there's a great set of studies done by speech pathologists trying to figure out how low somebody's F0 has to be perceived as male, or how high somebody's F0 has to be perceived as female. And they've identified, a particular range of maybe 150 to 175 or sorry, 165 hertz as a sort of crossover zone. But we also have these cases of a trans woman being perceived as male despite having a mean F0 above 180 hertz. Trans women being perceived as female with an F0 as low as below 130 hertz. So clearly vocal sex and gender is not a single characteristic. In the piece that I just cited, I found that speakers with the lowest F0 also had the highest frequency or most quote unquote feminine productions of S. So features other than F0 must matter, and there are way more than two ways that these features can cluster together. And that's really important. That tells us that there are more than two forms of gendered voices. Great. Okay. I don't want to get behind time, so I just want to discuss this last lesson, and then I will conclude. So this last point has to do with the ideological nature of vocal sex and gender. You may or may not be familiar with this great research on how people categorize ambiguous sounds. But it's shown that when you have an ambiguous sound that's gendered, the gender category the listener believes the speaker to belong to will impact how it's categorized. They specifically looked at S and esh, and because S tends to be lower frequency for men than for women, that stands to reason that then an ambiguous token would be more likely to be perceived as S if the person thinks a man is speaking, or as esh if the person thinks a woman is speaking. But just believing the gender of the speaker, even if you're hearing the same thing, will impact how you're hearing them. And Strand followed up on this to show that gender normativity also plays a role here. Ideology may be especially important for ambiguous voices. So one study looking at intonation among trans women, cisgender women, and cisgender men found that using this sort of threshold of 2 semitones, they compared the frequency of upward intonational contours across these 3 groups. And they found that the trans women who had more rising intonational contours were more likely to be perceived as female, even though there was no actual difference between the cis women and the cis men in the study. So this is something that may not play out in terms of gender normative populations, but because of its ideological and stereotypical associations, people are able to categorize perhaps more ambiguous voice on the basis of those ideologies and stereotypes. I've also done a little bit on how language ideologies impact the degree of vocal normativity that trans women and trans men take on. So one thing that we really need to consider as a field is how linguist ideologies impact their perception of speakers, and to bring our own perceptions into the realm of our analysis. Another thing that I would love to see people examine more closely is how different kinds of ideologies might impact perception. So does having a counter-hegemonic or trans-affirming gender ideology change how people will categorize someone's gender or sex? Okay, so these are the 4 main lessons that I wanted to discuss. There are a couple of more that we can talk about in the Q&A, but I did want to just wrap up by characterizing translinguistics. So a translinguistics is a perspective on linguistics that is inherently dynamic. So change and transformation are recognized as essential parts of life for all of us. It's a denaturalizing linguistics in which ideologically convenient accounts of gender cannot hold. It's also recentering field. So trans people don't exist just to be compared to cis people, but on their own terms. It's unavoidably political. I love that Tyler talked a little bit about prescriptivism and how we might see that differently. And I think a translinguistics would certainly endorse that different view. It's also an imaginative field. It's one that's interested in what's possible, in what might be exceptional, not just in identifying generalizable norms. And it's an empowering linguistics. The connections between research and community action are prioritized, and trans people are always actively engaged in this work. And I'll say, just not to be confused with Lee and Dobson's use of translinguistics as a single word, which has nothing to do with trans people. And so I say the word trans is for this framework, since that is in fact the name for the people who are centered by it. I just want to underline that I think we really need to do better in our theorization and implementation of sex and gender in linguistics. And we can talk about strategies for that when we discuss. But just briefly, some of the ways we can do better: we can ask better questions in terms of our participants' identities. We can think about alternative ways of modeling gender rather than assuming a categorical binary is going to be best. We can be much more cautious and do our homework before we advocate for binary or biology-driven gender explanations. We can cultivate relationships with trans collaborators, including our trans students. And we can ask, regardless of whether trans people are centrally involved in the study or not, how we can incorporate the insights and wisdom of trans experience into linguistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lal. Next, we will be hearing from Dominique Canning.
Sorry, my mouse disappeared and I need to stop sharing.
All right, just give me a sec to get everything sorted. All right. Oh. Share. Okay. Awesome. The second I did that, my notes disappeared, but it's okay. We'll be fine. Okay, so my name is Dominique Canning. Today I am going to be talking about my previous research on Titus Andromedon in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate at University of Michigan, and at the sort of bottom of the screen, you can see my email and my Twitter where you can contact me. And today I am presenting Which Box to Check, Language, Race, and Sexuality in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Oh dear, let me see. Okay, I'm getting used to Zoom, so I'm trying to figure out where I click. Okay, so first I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline on what exactly Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt is. I'll tell you who Titus is. I will then go through my own research on this. I'll give you some background and some information on my design, data collection, and hypotheses. I don't go into super close detail on it. So if you have more questions about that, I'm happy to answer them later, either as part of the Q&A or as like an email or Twitter discussion. And then I will tell you my results, and also I'll talk a little bit about how I would want to sort of rethink the way I approach this research, and ways that I think linguistics can also sort of work on how we approach work on sexuality and race and language. Okay, so the picture you see is Titus Andromedon, the character. Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt is a Netflix show. Actually, I think it was a Netflix show. It's recently ended. It first aired in 2015. The show doesn't specifically target queer or Black viewers. I mean, it doesn't like exclude them, obviously, but they're not the target audience, which kind of has to do with the way that Titus is portrayed, I think. The show focuses on Kimmy Schmidt, who meets Titus Andromedon after moving to New York City. Kimmy is very inexperienced with the world, so Titus is kind of there to introduce it to her. But the main point is that Titus Andromedon is a side character. He's often described as a fan favorite. The people I've asked about the show are always like, oh, I love Titus, or they hear I'm doing this research and they're like, yay, Titus. He is portrayed by an actor named Titus Burgess, which is why I'm going to do my best to refer to them by their surnames instead of saying Titus and Titus. So Burgess is the actor, Andromedon is the character. They do share quite a few characteristics. They're both openly gay. They're both from southern states, and they're both performers. Burgess a lot more successfully than Andromedon. So Burgess and Andromedon are somewhat involved or affiliated with musical theater, acting, singing on its own. So yes, okay. So my broad research questions, I wanted to know a little bit about how language is used to express intersecting identities, because that's a question that I've had for a while, just thinking about, how, is it still broadcasting? Okay. When you have certain features in common between two styles that are associated with an identity, what does the speaker do? Do they pick one or the other? Do they pull from both? And so to do that, I wanted to use media. And so I was also asking, how can media help us better understand the interaction between language and identity? And more specifically, I wanted to know how does a Black gay character use language to perform identity on screen? And the media part is very important because there's often an assumption in linguistics, though I think this is lessening, that using media isn't a good idea because it's very scripted. But I just want to remind everybody that scripted media does not exist outside of society. So the writers, the actors, the editors, the producers, the cameramen, they all bring their own ideas and stereotypes about language and people to the craft that they're creating. Okay, so I looked at two styles or varieties. The first was gay sounding speech. The other was African American language, which I will explain a little bit more about on the next slide. So gay sounding speech, literature primarily talks about features associated with white, gay, cisgender men. Of course, there have been people who have looked at other communities. So there's Rusty Barrett, who did work with African American drag queens, though I don't believe he actually calls it gay sounding speech. Increasingly, I've heard people working on the features of gay sounding speech as they relate to trans men. So I think Lal has actually done work on that. Sorry, Lal. And so gay sounding, the name is meant to call attention to the fact that there's variation within and between gay communities and individuals. I don't know that it does that, but I'll get to that a little bit later in the talk. The features I looked at that have also been discussed in the literature are S duration and pitch, release T, so whether or not you say what or what. So aspirated T release word finally, pitch range and voice quality, which also kind of goes with pitch range. So you have things like vocal fry or creaky voice that are related to like low pitch, and then you have falsetto, which is related to higher pitch. And so you also have like those extremes within pitch range. And then a very important note to remember is that percepts of gayness often rely on more than one feature. So it's not just like, oh, they have a wider pitch range, so they're obviously gay. It's quite a bit more complicated than that. African American language. I'm using the term African American language, or AAL, to mean something more similar to African American vernacular English. There's different people use the term African American language a little bit differently. And so I just wanted to clarify that. So I'm talking about it as if it were African American vernacular English. So I looked at phonological features like consonant cluster reduction, monophthongization, the L plus H star pitch accent, so prosody and intonation within AAL research is actually like quite on the rise, but in the past has not been studied as much as some other features. And so outside of the L plus H star pitch accent, there's also been some work on intonation in questions. So where a mainstream US English speaker or Muse speaker might rise at the end of a sentence when they're asking a question, you sometimes find that AAL speakers will fall at the end of a question or use a level tone. Grammatical features I looked at were habitual B, null copula, negative concord or double or multiple negatives, and the omission of third person singular and possessive S. And what happens with the grammatical features is actually kind of interesting. So I will go on to tell you about that in a minute, because I have more stuff to tell you about my research background. So language and identity, this is really what I like to focus on broadly within linguistics, but we often study identities as if they exist in isolation, but we know through people's personal experiences, we know through other types of research that identities are not experienced in isolation. We do know that identity is performed through action, clothing, speech. Although I guess I should say we're working from the assumption that identity is performed through those things, and it's a fairly accepted assumption. And within linguistics, I also used the idea of indexical fields, which is just saying that meaning and ideology are tied to the surrounding society. And you can have one variable, so something like aspirated tea release, and that can be used to index a number of different identities depending on the person's position, the context they're in, what other features they use in combination with that. And then the definition of style I'm working from is style as a linguistic tool that allows a speaker to position themselves within a particular context. And within this, we see that features are used at differing rates depending on the situation. So an example of this would be in Rob Podesta's work, where he looks at a speaker, Heath, in three different situations and finds that falsetto use is highest when he's at a barbecue with his friends, second highest when he's on the phone with his dad, and then lowest when he's in a meeting with a client. So, okay. All right. Language in media. Language is obviously used within media to enact identity. Hopefully this moves away from the idea that you can automatically see a person's identity. Whether or not that happens with Titus is still a question for me, but I will talk about that a little bit more. Conan, specifically in Conan's example, she is talking about race and language within TV shows and things. So like the assumption you can see a person's race, so you don't have to make them sound like that race. Media does act as a lens through which sociological patterns can be examined. So like I was saying earlier, the writers, the producers, the actors, they're all bringing their own sociological baggage with them when they're creating. So it's not just, you don't have a TV show as like a blank slate. I also want to note that though they're often avoided or talked about as if they should be avoided, which is true. In many cases, stereotypical features are often used to make a character's identity more accessible to an audience. And I bring this up particularly because one of the episodes I look at is the first episode of the series. And that's the episode where we first see Titus. And so the language that I picked that episode because the language he uses in the episode might be sort of motivated by the fact that you need to know who Titus is very quickly. You need to know what he's like. You need to be able to draw certain conclusions about him very quickly. So, okay. So general research design, I compared Titus Burgess, the actor, to Titus Andromedon to see if he was adding or avoiding features within his speech. I looked at grammatical and phonological features associated with AAL and gay-sounding speech. And my goal was to use a sort of intersectional approach to examine one way that Black gay identity is performed through language. Data collection, I looked at 4 episodes of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Episode 1, Kimmy Goes Outside, that is the first episode, so we first meet Titus. Episode 5, Kimmy Kisses a Boy. That episode involves Titus trying to convince Kimmy that her friend's boyfriend is actually a gay man. Episode 8, Titus gets a job as a werewolf in a production at the restaurant he works at, and is kind of, while he's walking around in his werewolf costume, is kind of thinking about the differences between his experiences dressed up as a werewolf to his experiences when he's dressed up as a gay man. Kimmy's in a love triangle, or episode 10. Titus is tired of getting passed over for parts at his job, so he goes to see a straight coach, which was actually a very interesting episode. Like I could do a whole paper just on that episode. I looked at 2 interviews, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and an LA Times interview with Sarah Rodman. I included the total episode and interview data because I did omit things like overlapping speech, background music, and audio or audience reactions. For the episodes, I only looked at scenes Titus was in, and that also was further restricted to like scenes that Titus speaks in because I was looking at Titus's speech. So yeah. Yeah, that's everything. So my hypotheses were that all features are expected to occur in both the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt episodes and in the interviews, though at differing rates. Rates of features associated with AAL are and gay sounding speech are expected to vary based on 2 broad topics, race and sexuality. Rates of features associated with AL are expected to vary based on the interview type. So the first one has to do with episodes and interviews. The second one has to do with just the episodes, and the third one has to do with just the interviews. And so quick summary, I expected Burgess to use features from his own speech when he's performing as Andromedon. Andromedon's speech is expected to reflect the identity most relevant to his storyline within an episode. And third, Burgess is expected to accommodate his speech to his interviewer's identity, with one interviewer being a Black woman and the other being a white man. General results, like I said, I have more detailed information too if you would like them later. But generally, Andromedon has a higher speaking pitch than Burgess and a wider pitch range. There is an avoidance of grammatical AAL features by both Burgess and Andromedon. Burgess uses exactly one grammatical feature, and it is negative concord in an interview with Stephen Colbert, and Andromedon uses none. S-pitch was higher in episodes than in interviews, though duration was not, at least significantly, as far as like p-values go. Features of gay sounding speech were used more overall. And something interesting is that I think both Andromedon and Burgess are using something a little bit closer to a standard variety. And I wonder, of course, I don't know the motivations of the writers and the actor because I haven't been able to ask them, but they might be avoiding AAL because of Andromedon's feminine gay identity, and previous research by Buchholz and Lopez show that, and also Kelly Wright's research show that AAL does sometimes come with a perception of like higher masculinity. In media, it's often tied to hyper-masculinity too. So I guess it would make sense that they would avoid it to keep people from perceiving Titus as like too masculine. So a quick summary of results by hypothesis. Hypothesis 1, yes, did happen. With the exception of grammatical AL features, all the features did show up in both episodes and interviews. For hypothesis 2, the features do vary between episodes, but they don't really appear to vary based on episode topic. To be fair, the episode topic is not particularly well done within the episode, so that might be a reason why we see that result. And then rates of features associated with AL are expected to vary based on interview type. There are differences based on interview type, but I can't like conclusively say that it's because he's talking to a Black woman in one and a white man in another, because the settings were quite different. So for the Sarah Rodman interview, it's just him and Sarah and a camera crew, and I think his agent in a room filming the interview. For the Stephen Colbert one, there's a live audience, there's a band. I think the entire feel of the interview was a little bit more laid back. It wasn't just like, tell us about your character in the show. It was sort of, tell us a little bit about your life. And Burgess had been on the show before, so they were familiar with each other, they were joking around. So I think that might have also played a role. Right. Okay, so this is the part where I want to do a little bit of a wider discussion about how I approached my research and how I think we can address things like race within queer linguistics a little bit better. So again, there's not a significant difference between Burgess's use of AAL features compared to Andromedon, but there are some significant differences significant as in statistically, significant differences in gay-sounding speech features between the two. And I think the presence of gay-sounding speech features, while AAL features are not present, might be motivated by Andromedon's feminine gay male identity being the most relevant to the show. And again, kind of getting back to that idea of needing to very quickly convey somebody's identity within like a sentence or a few lines. And so if AAL is tied to hyper-masculine performance, you're going to avoid using AAL for your character that's not hyper-masculine. And you also have to think about things like perceptions of gay men in media, perceptions of Black men in media, perceptions of gay Black men in media when or if they exist in media. And so I think there's a lot happening here that wasn't quite accounted for, but this data also shows that Black gay speech may be something a little bit more complex than just saying gay sounding speech plus African American language. And so we have to think about in sort of our framing of languages and styles and varieties, who isn't being heard. So really what I realized in doing this work is that we're not really talking about Black queer people within linguistics research. We've sort of created polarized ideologies around gay sounding speech and African American language where even unintentionally, I would like to say I don't know that it's people just saying like, we're excluding all these people because we want to. I think it's quite a bit more complicated than that, but we've sort of positioned gay sounding speech as white, gay, hyper-standard. And we, in a lot of the research, and this is something that happens wider in linguistics too, we don't really name the race, right? If they're not people of color. So we don't name the race in gay sounding speech research. And so we're kind of just treating whiteness as like a blank slate that like gayness is kind of thrown onto linguistically. But at the same time, African-American language is positioned as being used and belonging to Black speakers. It's positioned as straight, non-standard. This also doesn't really get into like gender. So there's not a ton of information about queer women's speech. There's increasing information, but still not a lot of information on like non-binary speech and trans speech. And for African-American language, we have the same things where there's a lot less research on Black women's speech than there is for Black men's speech. But we still kind of just treat it as like, this is what Black people sound like. And so we have to remember that relationships to a person's language and to language varieties are influenced by a person's position within the world. And that is something that I don't see within the literature as much. It's increasing, but yeah, I'll leave it there. So in conclusion, in rethinking Black queerness in language, I think I should be upfront and say that my previous methodology, despite what I wanted to do within my research, my previous methodology kind of assumed that for a Black gay speaker, it would be gay sounding speech plus African American language. They exist separately, and then they kind of like mix up and combine to create something fun in the middle as needed. And this sort of implies that identity and its performance are additive. So like, sometimes you're Black and sometimes you're gay, sometimes you're Black and you're gay, but it's not like you're Black you're a Black gay person all the time. And this kind of fails to consider the ways race, gender, and sexuality interact in navigating the world, both linguistically and otherwise. In the future, I would like to apply a little bit more intersectionality theory, or more purposefully apply it to research, but I also think it should be applied a little bit more to sociolinguistics in general. And that would make it possible to examine identity performance outside of a single axis framework, which is just sort of the idea that like we have to focus on just Blackness, or we have to focus just on queerness, or you have to focus just on being a woman. So Crenshaw's work looks at the 1989 paper specifically looks at 3 different cases, discrimination cases that are sort of put forth by Black women. And in many of the cases, they're told that they either have to base the discrimination on being Black, or they have to base the discrimination on being women. But it's not accepted that they can base it on being specifically Black women, even though their experiences are specific to their being Black women. And so I think applying an intersectional framework to queer linguistics research will make it possible to further understand the complex ways queer identity is navigated, not just for white people, or sorry, white queer people. I always try to say white queer people of color, and that's not how that works. So for white queer people, because there's also things like gender and class are also relevant in those cases, but especially with queer people of color, I think we need to be a little bit more purposeful in saying that like queerness, and in the case of my research, Blackness, they are equally important, and we can't treat one, or we can't look at one without also considering how the other identity influences the way they use language. So thank you. Again, here's my email and my Twitter, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dominique. Next, we will hear from Bryce McCleary.
Hello. You will hear from me, I think, if I can get my slides up and going. Okay, hi. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to Abraleen for hosting us, and thanks to Lowell, Tyler, and Dominique for being here and doing this. They're just incredible researchers, aren't they? So I'm Bryce E. McCleary, and I am from Oklahoma State University, a recent PhD. And today I'm going to be delivering a talk called Oklahoma, Drag, and Language Regard, a study in queer folk linguistics, in which I'm talking a bit about my work with drag performers, a community of practice of drag performers in Oklahoma City. Before I get started on that, however, I want to acknowledge that this work was carried out on stolen land and at an institution that benefits economically from the continued destruction of indigenous sovereignty. Oh. Sorry, one second. My computer screen is being quite strange. Specifically, this project was finished on land in the unceded territory of the Osage and Wichita nations. I also want to warn that there's some explicit language in these speech samples, specifically some cursing. But yes, well, having said that, I'll move right into it. First, I want to just remind everyone that Oklahoma is here, smack dab in the middle of the United States, right above Texas, northwest of Louisiana, west of Arkansas. It's been described before as a being on the periphery of the South, of the U.S. South, and it inherits quite a bit of grammatical features, vowel system influence from the South, as well as from the Midlands. So it's quite an interesting place to study dialectologically, and it just so happens that that's how I got started studying or researching in Oklahoma. That is on the Research on Dialects of English in Oklahoma project, a perceptual dialectological project that employed socio and folk linguistic interviews, as well as map tasks a la Preston 1981, in which we asked non-linguists to mark dialect areas or perceived dialect areas across the state and encourage them to use labels as well, most of which were evaluative or critical in some ways. There was also a reading passage and a word list and folk linguistic questions. That is, questions for these non-linguists about what they thought of language and language-related issues. Now, I focus primarily on queer Oklahomans. And I, admittedly, they were mostly white, cisgender gay men. And in their responses to these, I saw quite frequently answers like this, that Oklahoma is still very set in the men and female gender roles and their stereotypes. And if you don't have a deep voice for a man, they think differently. And if you don't have a soft female voice, they're like, oh, she's not very classy. Well, it should also be noted that Oklahoma, being where it's at, also has sort of a reputation for these sorts of ideologies, these conservative ideologies about gender, about sex, that very often correlate with homophobia, transphobia, and racism. So perhaps it's not surprising to find then that when asking these people, the respondents in this study, about sounding gay, there was a lot of trepidation in admitting their willingness to express themselves as queer people in Oklahoma because of the negative consequences. One person, in fact, said, if I immediately left a group of gay people and walked over to a group of straight people, I would be more wary of how I sounded, and gives an example of how they bumped into someone the night before and says, my voice got really low. I was like, sorry. Sometimes if I'm not paying attention, but also if I don't feel secure, I try to like present more masculine. This is actually pretty important because I think that it gives some insight into the fact that there's not a whole lot of there's not many public safe spaces for queer Oklahomans. But one of them that is really important is the place where I did most of my study, and it's referred to as the Gayborhood. So here's Oklahoma, here's the state, there's Oklahoma City, and that star on this map represents an area where I spent 3 years of observation and conversations. It's known as the Gayborhood by some participants. It's also referred to as the Strip by many and has been documented. It has a history of queer culture back to the 1920s. It was with underground gay bars and clubs that were sort of thriving in the 40s and 50s, only to be followed by police brutality and harassment in the 1960s and 70s, which led to rioting and protesting, and eventually found a sort of safe haven and protection in this place. And by the 1980s, the majority of Oklahoma City's gay and queer bars were located here. I think it's important to note that this particular area is also the hub of drag entertainment within Oklahoma City. And I spent the 3 years of observing and having conversations with people here, and then 2 years recording interviews and discussion groups in and around this particular area. The data I'm going to talk about today comes primarily from these 6 respondents. Notice that they're arranged here in years of experience in this community, in the industry performing, with 3 about having 2 years or less and 3 having about 10 to 20 years of experience. There's also demographic information here. You'll see ethnic identity and gender identity. All of those were actually blank slots given on a piece of paper to the respondents where they were allowed to write in their own labels. It should be noted also that I tried to capture their spelling and capitalization conventions here, and that these respondents very often talk about being non-cisgender and don't always use labels which are easily read or interpreted as non-cisgender, likely because of the sociocultural situation for being in a place like Oklahoma. Okay, so one of the most interesting questions that I think was asked, or at least that produced some of the most interesting responses, was, is there such a thing as a drag style of speech? Here's what Giselle had to say.
I definitely say there is. I feel like we have a code, and a lot of people wouldn't understand it sometimes.
Giselle's comments here actually align quite a bit with what everyone else had to say. This idea that there's a drag style of speech aligns with a code or a slang even. In fact, slang is something that pops up quite a bit. It's something that people frequently go to directly after being asked this question. Notice also that Kelly here doesn't use the word slang. She says there is a drag style of speech, but it's not any different from what's used in the gay community. This is a little bit different from what some of the other respondents had to say, but I'm going to get to the nuances of those differences here in a bit. So Many respondents also offered words or examples of in-group language or of this slang that's used within the community. And here are some of the most frequently occurring words within the particular community or as a response to this question. And I find it quite interesting that bitch is one that's used here, particularly because I don't think that most people think of bitch as being a word solely associated with queer people or perhaps with drag queens, and certainly not with Oklahoma drag queens. But before we give in to doubt just yet, this is a good point to remember that a big part of this particular project and of this study is remembering that language regard or non-linguist ideas, beliefs, attitudes, reactions to language is critical for this particular approach to the study of language. I think it's also important to remember here that there is a sort of history of not trusting non-linguists and their ideas of language. Tyler mentioned earlier Leonard Bloomfield and his role in early linguistics. Bloomfield and his family were actually known to use a phrase called stankos, referring to non-linguist ideas about language, which they thought would inevitably be silly and stupid and uneducated. I don't think that that kind of attitude is quite as ubiquitous across the field of linguistics, certainly not within sociolinguistics, but there are still some attitudes that sort of echo that. It wasn't really until 1965 at the UCLA Conference for Sociolinguistics that Hunnixvall gave a formal proposal for the study of folk linguistics. And at it, most of the discussants who were there actually agreed that the study of non-linguist production, reaction, and perception of language are all really crucial in the study of language variation and change. But some of the concerns that were brought up did have to do with what non-linguists can know or what they do know. Namely that many people, or at least Labov had noticed that many people he had talked to would hear extremely nasalized speech and extremely denasalized speech and refer to them both as nasal. Now, at first sight, that might seem to say, oh, okay, non-linguists don't really know what the difference is. Why would they have to know? They haven't studied nasality. They're not phoneticians. But a few years later, Preston says, what if we rethink this and give the non-linguists a little bit more credit? That is, what if the non-linguists are remarking on what they perceive to be inappropriate levels of nasality? In the case of nasalized speech, they're hearing too much nasality. And in the case of denasalized speech, they're hearing not enough nasality. In this case, what we're really seeing is a difference between the folk and technical vocabularies, but not necessarily in a difference in understanding, and certainly not in a way that's indicative of a non-linguist's lack of ability to understand rather complex linguistic phenomena. So this, of course, gives rise to the field of folk linguistics. And a lot of this really focused early on meta-language and language attitudes, more explicit types of language regard, but more recently has leaned on presupposition and implicata as a sort of informative way of looking at this. So returning to the idea of this word bitch and these among the other words or examples of drag slang, I took these non-linguists quite seriously, and in a transcript of about 20,000 words from some sections of these interviews, did a quick search of all of those words that were offered. And it just so happens that bitch occurs far more than any of the others. Interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, it's used nominatively and vocatively. I think we probably would expect that. But there is an in-group self-reference usage here, one that I actually think is borrowed from African-American language, but I won't make any definitive claims because I need to do more research. But they look sort of like this. Ray says, hey, how you doing, child? Yes, get turned up, get a drink, be yourself, and tip a bitch. And Ray is not advocating for philanthropy here. She's saying tip me. Foxy says, a bitch don't know no country by heart, meaning I don't know any country by heart. So this is quite interesting because the sort of responses, the regard responses to a question about this community of practice and their ideas about language led to a realization that there's some structural variation happening here, particularly when we look at bitch as a discourse marker. Foxy uses it as such. You know, bitch, I couldn't lip sync to save my life, bitch. If that show was back then, bitch, I sure would have left because, bitch, I couldn't lip sync for shit. And similarly, Giselle says, I can do it in so many ways, talking about using the word bitch. You know, you just learn the news, bitch. And notice here that we have a lengthened vowel and some breath equality with the vowel as well. And this is a little bit different from Foxy's use, this sort of discourse marker use of bitch, but certainly for Foxy's case, you can see that bitch is being used to hold the floor. That is to keep the turn going for Foxy so she can continue her story. Quite unlike what I think the sort of typical expectations for the way that bitch might get used. And this all sort of comes from following up on the non-linguist ideas about what words are used in this particular community. So far, looking at this particular question, we've seen a lot of explicit responses, that is, talk about drag slang, examples of drag slang. And I mentioned before the interest in implicit and presuppositional details within regard, but that also should be applied to questions. So here we get the sort of presupposed idea that there is a drag style of anything, and perhaps an encouragement to think about a drag language connection here. And perhaps that serves as the motivation for why we're getting such explicit commentary on slang and perhaps in-group language use. But right after this question, all respondents were asked the question, what does it mean to talk like a drag queen? A question that admittedly and intentionally relies on archetypal, if not stereotypical ideas about drag queens, at least for this community. And we might suspect that, or we can see that there's, sort of presupposed ideas that drag queens can talk a certain way, or you can talk like a category, and perhaps motivating an idea about a drag queen and language connection here too. So we might hypothesize or expect that we'd see more implicit kinds of regard responses here. I turn now to Gwen and her response to just this question.
Talk like a drag queen. I don't know. I've always been gay as hell, so I've always, I guess, kind of talked like that. But I guess just like to use a terminology and know what it means, where it comes from. Like it's because it's funny. Like if whether it's a straight friend who it's never been out before, or like someone who's like new to coming out or anything like that, to hear them say stuff, you're just kind of like, oh, like no, that's not how you use that, girl. Like that's not right. Like hang on just a second.
Notice that first Gwen says, I've always been gay as hell, so I've always, I guess, kind of talked like that. And admittedly, we've got some hedging in the latter part of this, but so here structurally functions as sort of a logical link between always having been gay and always talking kind of like a drag queen. This sort of hints at an idea that permeates a lot of the research I've done in Oklahoma, at least. That is the idea that drag queens are somehow the pinnacle or the extreme example of gayness. And on the periphery of that, there's typically some sort of language component associated with it. But later, Gwen says, a straight friend who's never been out before, or someone who's new to coming out, you hear them say stuff and you're like, oh, no, that's not right. That's not how you use that. So here we're getting another sort of like alignment of a person who's an outsider, a straight person, or someone who's not been out much before or doesn't come out at all, to hear them use in-group language, they likely don't know how to use it. I think the presuppositional stuff that we find here, that's not how you use that. That's not right. That is, the presupposition is that there's a right way of using it. And although that is probably a really simple existential presupposition, I think it's important because it hints at a certain type of prescriptivism within this particular community. That is an idea of how in-group language gets used, how it should be used, and who gets to use it. But it's not quite the same, or at least the critical aspects offered by these respondents in terms of language use and the spread of language use are not necessarily all identical. So as a reminder, these sort of implicit and explicit regard distinctions are pretty important for the study of looking at language regard overall, and they're important to think about in terms of what our questions do. But before we move on beyond this, these sort of examples that we've looked at here, and try to complicate it or situate it within this particular community, I think I have to introduce what this whole talk is about. In addition to a sort of queered approach to language science, this is also a queered approach to the study of language regard. And what I mean by that is that I don't think it's a new thing to propose the study of non-linguist regard for language as a critical way of thinking about language use or language study or linguistic investigations. But more importantly, the particular way that I see queer folk linguistics interacting with language regard. And that is that it's bridging language regard and queer or sociocultural linguistics. That is, it's related to identity. We see language regard as at least potentially, being something that is offered in a particular situational context in which the speaker is offering their ideas or beliefs or thoughts on language, and presumably that reflects who they are and how they're interacting with this language or language adjacent phenomenon. I should also mention here that purely by oversight by myself here, that I didn't include specifically translinguistics as something that also would be included or also should be and must be included for a further development of queer folk linguistics. Sorry, Lal. But it is, and I want to iterate that specifically, that translinguistics must be a part of this as well. So you might think of this as a sociocultural approach to language regard, but I also see it as a methodological supplement to the research on LGBTQ plus populations, namely in that research on queer people and on queer populations is already sort of interested in non-linguist ideas about language. That is, people's preferred pronouns, or the ways that people describe their own gender, or the ways that people have experienced linguistic or language-related discrimination. And I think that queer folk linguistics offers at least a little bit of methodological help and perhaps complexity in studying just such things. So in thinking about language regard and identity, and returning to the idea of the spread of drag language and culture, I now am turning to an example from Alexander, a drag king in Oklahoma City, and his drag sister, Ray, and what they had to say about it.
Which a lot of these are coming out into normal speech for most everyone because of RuPaul's. But I'm tired of people comparing drag close to them to RuPaul's. So like they'll come up, they'll see one of us in drag and be like, work, and it's like, you don't even know what that means. Fuck off. Thank you. Bye.
If you don't know the slur, don't say it. Okay. Just rewind it again. If you don't know the slur, do not say it.
Say it again for the people in the back.
If you don't know the slur, do not say it.
I could talk about this quote all day because it's one of my favorites, but I think the most important thing to note here is that Alexander and Ray are both exhibiting a sort of prescriptivist idea about who gets to use language use, how you shouldn't use it if you don't know how it's used, and that there's a certain right way to use it. So now we've seen all three of this small data set, the members of the sort of least experienced people here are at least somewhat engaging in prescriptivist ideas about how in-group language use needs to be used. The other three more experienced performers have rather more nuanced critiques of the spread of language and drag culture and language. But before we move on to that, I think it's important to remind ourselves that queer folk linguistics borrows from queer linguistics and sociocultural linguistics, the idea that identity and practice are tied together. And in the example that we've seen with these three rather inexperienced performers, their expressions of language regard are clearly offering stance taking. And here I mean that in a sort of like more broad sense, you know, whether we're talking about agreement, alignment, disalignment, neutrality, but also positioning and footing, which I use more specifically to refer to evaluative and affective sort of stance taking. And in this case, we see Alexander and Ray sort of positioning themselves as in-group members. And remember that these people, these respondents with fewer years of experience have the most to lose by appearing not to be authentic or appearing not to be authoritative in at least what they're allowed to be authoritative over. So all of this positioning is sort of directly feeding into their identity as belonging into this particular community and being performers in the Oklahoma City community. And that, of course, informs the broader themes of identity and linguistic practice and the sort of relationship between those in the study of language regard in this particular community. So keeping that in mind, here's what Foxy had to say on the spread of language. Oh, no, sorry, I jumped the gun. I think before we get into what other people have to say, it's important to remember that intersectionality is crucial to the study of identity, particularly in a community like this. That is, the idea that no one category is sufficient to account for individual experience or behavior, borrowing from Erez Levin's work here. But by behavior, I think that we can make a direct link here to sort of the linguistic or sociolinguistic patterns that we see in research. And this is really important for a community like this, in which there's a wide variation in terms of gender identity, in terms of ethnic identity, lived experiences, class background, but things that they all have in common are place. Growing up in a place like Oklahoma or Oklahoma City, where it's not so easy to be a queer person, and being protected in this particular little queer community. That inevitably interacts with other complex components of identity as well. And having said that, ratiolinguistics is also a really critical part of this. On the one hand, because I'm a white researcher and there are people of color in this data set. And so I think that it takes the responsibility of researchers like me to take extra steps to be careful, reliable, and just with the representation and analysis of data from people of color. But perhaps just as importantly, because African-American language and culture has influenced a great deal of drag culture and drag language. And I think it's also important here to tie into what Dominique just talked about, these sort of oppositional ideologies between gay sounding speech or queer speech and African-American language. I think that at least within this particular drag community, this community has inherited a great deal from African-American language and culture. And I think that there's reason to suspect that lots of the things that we sort of automatically associate with gay sounding speech, and which subsequently has been sort of filtered now through an idea of proper or articulate or prissy or other kinds of speech. I think a lot of these things might actually ultimately have been influenced or borrowed from African-American language itself, but that's something I can talk more about later. So now, having said that, we'll return to what Foxy had to say about the spread of drag language and culture.
And then, TV is all about, it's universal. So, of course, there's straight people, gay people, everybody watch TV. So, who have never been around it, of course, like, oh my gosh, she's so funny. I never heard that before. They're looking at us like, girl, have you heard what's her name still on the gay show? I said that last night when I was drunk.
Yeah.
I said that last night to Bart Mahone.
Right.
Like, bitch.
So if we paraphrase what we've seen in terms of the critique of drag language use and the spread of drag language and culture, we see that the three most inexperienced performers have to say something about this sort of prescriptivist attitude towards usage, who can use it, who shouldn't, and that there are incorrect ways of using it. But Foxy's comment is really that the language on TV didn't come from TV. And perhaps more importantly, I use that language and have been using that language and I'm not getting credit for it. Me speaking as Foxy, not as Bryce. Interestingly, Kelly, another seasoned performer, also makes note of this sort of like the smoke and mirrors of TV, the cuts and edits, and that what they're doing here or what she's doing here is live and raw. But remember earlier I showed you that she also says that there is a drag style of speech, but it's not anything different than what you hear in the gay community. So there's not as much attention to the origin or who's using this originally or the authentic speakers of this particular of speech style for Kelly, which is still a bit different from the younger or less experienced performers, but still not quite the same as what Foxy has to say. Now, the very first excerpt I showed you was from Giselle, and Giselle's comment on a sort of a code, and a lot of people have a hard time understanding it sometimes. Giselle actually goes on to describe something quite complex and nuanced, and now I'm going to show you just what that was.
I definitely say there is. There's I feel like we have a code, and a lot of people wouldn't understand it sometimes. I think a lot of it actually comes more from Paris's Burning, and then it's spreading out into mainstream and RuPaul's Drag Race. When you see now that it's on the screens, people are seeing those words, and now they're rolling out into other communities now. And but you know what? Funny is, a lot of our slang and stuff, I think a lot of it comes from the South. Because when I was watching the Housewives of Atlanta, they say a lot of stuff, and I'm thinking, like, they got this from the gay community. And I was like, what's funny? I think the gay community got this from the South. I think, like, what's the tea and all that stuff? That's these Georgia Peaches used to sit down and drink tea. So I think we get that a lot from Black women.
So if we go back to our paraphrasing here and we paraphrase what Giselle had to say, we might paraphrase it as, okay, this language and culture is spreading through pop culture, but it came from Black women. This concern for the origin or the authentic origin of this language certainly aligns more with what Foxy has to say than with what anyone else has to say. And so if we see this sort of split up like this, we can see a little bit of a pattern here, but first of all, this is a small data set, so we wouldn't want to generalize based on that. But I think that there's still a little bit more room for some understanding, namely because there's one critical part of an intersectional approach to identity within this community that has to be addressed. For example, Gwen, the only inexperienced performer to have said, to talk like a drag queen means to use terminology and to know what it means and where it comes from. That is, she's the only person who acknowledges that knowing the origin of such language is an important part of this. Well, before I explain why we might hypothesize Gwen is the only person to say that among her group of inexperienced performers, I want to talk about drag family, a rather complex and sometimes intimate queer kinship system that exists within drag communities and which is very strong in the community of Oklahoma City, in which there's very often a parent who sort of functions as a mentor or as an advisor, often helping younger inexperienced performers learn how to do makeup, learn how to put on what clothes to wear, how to put on a performance, how to network and to get to know people. And for example, there's a drag father in the particular community of Oklahoma City's drag scene, and he is the father of both Ray and Alexander. Ray and Alexander live together and spend a great deal of time together. And in fact, when I asked Alexander if he would sit down and do an interview with me, he said that I couldn't do it without his sisters because they're that close. Similarly, Foxy has had a number of drag children and used to be drag sisters with Giselle. Giselle did later leave Foxy's family. They still call each other sisters, are still very close, but they're just not officially a part of the same family. Giselle used to be Gwen's drag mother until about 7 or 8 years ago, at which point Foxy became Gwen's mother. And so Gwen actually spends more time probably, or at least at the time of this interview, spent more time with Foxy and Giselle than any other performer. And I want to reiterate that I mentioned the sort of the sociocultural dynamics in Oklahoma, and having done 3 years of conversational observational work in this particular community, I can say that the safety offered in this community not only protects queer people and the queer relationships here, but it also sort of bolsters the importance of these relationships within this particular community. And in some ways is reflective of the sociocultural and ideological forces that denies access to traditional kinship systems outside of this particular community for so many queer, trans, and non-binary people in Oklahoma. So having said that, this kind of makes sense as to why Gwen might be the only person who mentions the importance of knowing the origin of such slang or such words. And it just so happens that I mentioned earlier that the discourse uses of bitch, particularly this interesting usage of the discourse marker. It turns out that in looking through the transcripts, at least a preliminary study looking at this shows that Foxy is the queen of the usage of bitch, but that Giselle and Gwen are also using it quite as much, quite a lot also. Now they definitely have higher word counts and more time on the recordings than the other performers, but they still also are the only ones using the discourse marker use of bitch and are using bitch far more often than the others. So I leave you with some things to think about. Non-linguist regard for language is a crucial part of the study of language variation and change. It in fact can inform the third wave sociolinguistic interest in the movement and the motivation behind variation and change. Language regard is best studied when situated within the study of language and identity. And I think queer folk linguistics situates language regard within the study of intersectional identity specifically. And this requires sociocultural, queer, ratiolinguistic, and translinguistic perspectives as well. It requires sensitivity and intersectional approaches to the data, perhaps especially ethnographic work. And queer folk linguistics can inform where to observe and study linguistic phenomena. It can also demonstrate, as it does here, the importance of community and relational roles as a component of identity. And finally, I think this work and this project has demonstrated the complexity of place as it intersects with other complex identity components, which I think is a necessary thing to consider moving forward with a sort of queer approach to the science of language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryce. Now, if I could ask all of the panelists to turn their web cameras on. I think in the interest of brevity, there's also another event in an hour. So I think in the interest of brevity, especially for the attendees who have been here with us throughout the panel, we can take maybe 15 minutes for group discussion and Q&A, 15, 20 minutes. I have some prepared questions while I try to formulate the questions from the chat for the panelists. Lal, I was wondering if you could speak to So anyone who might be just getting into the linguistic study of queer and trans language varieties and variations, there's a lot of different terms for the subfields, right? So there's lavender language studies, there's queer and trans linguistics, queer linguistics, LGBTQ, any number of letters linguistics, and there seems to be right now a lot of negotiation within sort of this broader idea of a subfield on what the focus is, where the center is, and whose name essentially, whose identities could be attached to these types of subfields. Would you mind orienting your translinguistics within that for us?
Yeah, I actually, when I started thinking about this as a framework, had some trepidation of just sort of introducing yet another framework that people could use. And so my motivation is in large part not only theoretical, not only about the theoretical usefulness of this framework, but in thinking about the relationship between our research frameworks and the communities of people that we study. And that's really how I concluded that it's important to have a viewpoint on language and gender, language and identity, language and the body that really explicitly centers trans people who remain both underrepresented in the research and among scholars in the field. So I think one of the things that sort of naming frameworks can do is push us to sort of reestablish our footing, right? And think about the work that we do in new ways. So the way that I think about translinguistics is that it's just something that came to mind for me, but I also think it's really going to be the work of the now much larger group of scholars who are working with trans communities who will really develop that and figure out what that area of study is going to look like going forward. I also think it's useful to think about the connections between these different frameworks. We have not only queer linguistics, but we have decolonial linguistics. We have people thinking about language documentation in new ways. And I've kind of thrown around, I don't know how I feel about this, but like a linguistics of the oppressed, because there are certain elements of commonality, of shared experience within the field and within the world. And so I think it's also just as important to establish these coalitions across different marginalized communities within linguistics and related fields. Yeah, I'm hopeful that that's sort of one of the functions that we can fulfill by thinking about frameworks.
Thank you. Dominique, so I was wondering if you could speak to so working at this intersection, like you mentioned, of race, gender, and sexuality, how does your work sort of, and I guess some of the problems you've encountered with that, approaching language at that intersection, for you, what has that shown about certain deficiencies in linguistics as a sort of, in the academy, it's set apart by a majority of scholars as sort of this deracialized, degendered, desexualized entity of science. But what has your work shown or shed light on in terms of the deficiencies of that construct?
So, yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this, but I think something that became pretty clear. So my plan after working on Titus's speech, I wanted to look at the speech in Pose, because like it's a show that involves queer people of color as writers. The actors are queer people of color, and the positioning of like most of the characters are queer people of color as well, so they're all talking to each other. And so I was really excited to look at this, and what I ran into is that we rely a lot on categories in linguistics, especially when it comes to like coding data. So I kept running into this thing of like, oh, well, Blanca is using some features that sound kind of like AAL, but like also don't sound like AAL. And like, what is she doing? As far as like, I can't really say that in this scene, she's trying to perform masculinity because she's like very obviously not, but she's very clearly using AAL. And so we have like all these very like I guess, like siloed ideas about like what's happening with certain varieties. And it got very complicated very quickly. And I think the way we've been sort of approaching language, gender, race, and sexuality is that like we don't really have a way to incorporate all of those at the same time. We have very neat ways of sort of packaging them as separate things. And I think that's also why you end up with like a lot of work in AAL research is done on men, because it's a little bit, we're not really sure how to incorporate like women into that too. Or also thinking about, we're so focused on like what's especially marked that we're missing a lot of things that aren't especially marked, if that makes sense. So like if the characters in Pose are using something that's a little bit closer to a standard or like a hyper standard, there's not really a way to explain that, like, yes, they're also using features of AAL. They're using sort of a hyper standard, but they're doing it at the same time. It's not like you have one character talking to a character in one variety and then they turn and then switch varieties. It's often like within the same sentence. I think in a different talk, your talk a couple days ago, Bryce, you mentioned that one of your participants used aspirated T release at the end of a word and then said the same word in that same sentence and didn't aspirate it at all. And that was something I also saw a lot, and there's really no way to like code that in a way that makes sense.
Oops. Thank you, Dominique. Bryce, I have a question for you in terms of, I guess, the framework of Prestonian folk linguistics. So as you mentioned, sort of exemplified by Bloomfield, there is classist tendencies within linguistics to take the knowledge of the non-expert and say that that's inherently incorrect, or as Lal alluded to in my talk, saying that it's prescriptive and so it's automatically inherently wrong, right? Let alone the folk linguistic knowledge of drag queens, right? So how does engaging with this folk linguistic knowledge of this inherently non-normative community, how does that disrupt forms of knowledge production in linguistics and how we approach linguistic truths?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer, since Lal is here, I have to acknowledge and thank him, because last summer at the LSA Institute, I studied under Lal and actually begged him to read over my sort of like beginnings of musings of queer folk linguistics. So thanks, Lal. I hope it looks better than it did a year ago. So I think that in answering your question, Tyler, I'll speak a little bit frankly. I think at some point I got kind of disenchanted with being told, much like what Dominique just referred to in terms of like how it's hard to categorize things, how some things are, related to this ethnicity, but also this gender trope. I got kind of disenchanted with this, what I was being told primarily by linguists who were white, cis, and straight about what language meant. And one thing that I always sort of took seriously or took to heart that I think was clear to Dennis Preston, to Preston's work, but maybe not necessarily to everyone who ever read it, was that why don't you just ask what people think what things mean? Why don't you just ask what people, what different, even phonetic realizations mean? Of course, I'm very interested in this sort of presuppositional, implicational stuff because it has, implications for ideological realities, especially for queer people. But I think that folk linguistics, particularly a queer folk linguistics that sort of thinks about how identity is being constructed when people talk about language, that can give us some insight into what features mean and what styles mean beyond what linguists are telling us. I mean, I think that in a way of, one way of disrupting the system is by taking away some of the power from linguists and putting it back in the hands of non-linguists. If that makes any sense.
Thank you, Bryce. Now, a few questions from the chat, and these were as they came up as we were presenting, so I'm not entirely sure for certain what studies these are referring to, but for one, for Lal, there's a question, what was the age range of subjects? At what age did cis and trans subjects start displaying any variation in lexicon or speech pattern? So do you, yeah.
I'm not sure which, since I talked about a couple of different studies, but I'm guessing that that has to do with the changing voices of and changes in F0 in the transmasculine population I worked with. Age did seem to be a factor, and certainly when you asked the participants in my research, not just that study, but across a lot of them, there's a common sense, particularly among people who are making use of testosterone to change their voices, that the younger you are, the more flexible your voice will be, essentially. And I cannot confirm that because the population that I've worked with often skews young. So I get a lot of participants in their 20s, a couple in their 30s, a few older than that. So it's really not a balanced sample. But the older speakers that I've worked with, certainly their accounts of their experience is that their age makes it a little bit more difficult for their voices to change. Not clear whether that's physiological. There is a possible explanation of the laryngeal cartilage ossifying. That's something that happens as we get older, but it happens at different age points for different people. So you could be in your 40s and have a totally ossified larynx that's not going to change as easily, or you could be in your 40s and still have a non-ossified larynx, and so have some more flexibility there. I think it's important not to miss the social aspects of age as well, right? So I think the fact that, you know, if you spend 40 years using a particular type of voice before your voice changes, that might look different than using a particular voice for 20 years before your voice changes. So it's one of those things where I think it's really tricky to sort of tease apart what aspects of age are relevant. But absolutely, it was one of the things that was brought up most often, especially among older folks. I will say, though, that I've worked with older folks in their 40s, 50s, 60s who did have quite a lot of change in their voices. So it's clear that there are a number of different factors that play a role in that process.
Thank you. Yeah, trying to figure out which slides and which studies the questions are referring to is a part of the difficulty with this task. Let's see, another question, again for Lal. Are there examples of similar studies that use quantitative methodologies with significant results showing the presence of gender binaries and stereotypes in the lexicon of both self-identified trans and cis people?
I don't know of any studies that look systematically at lexical variation that compare trans and cis populations. I've recently done a little bit of corpus work looking at lexical variation in trans communities, but not comparing them to cisgender communities. I would expect, though, that if we did see that, we'd probably see a similar implementation and way of modeling gender. So whether we're talking about phonetics or the lexicon, which has really nothing to do with physiology, we still need to be thinking really carefully about, you know, for instance, if you use a gender binary and sort of impose that on your speakers, you may find a difference. Just as if we were doing class research and only had upper class and lower class, yeah, we'd probably find some differences, right? But then we'd miss out on all of the nuance, all of the interesting stuff that happens between the highest and lowest socioeconomic categories. So I think that's a message that I think, you know, we need to, even if we get results that look like what we might be expecting, to question whether those results tell the full story.
Thank you. Dominique, for you, it's more of a comment than a question, but maybe something that you would like to think out loud about for us. The comment was, it would be interesting to contrast the character/actor Titus with that of Laverne Cox and Sophia Burset in Orange is the New Black. So when we're thinking about looking at sort of these dynamic interactions between the identity of an actor and the performance of identity by a character, it's sort of in that context. What do you think? What do you think about that?
I think, so I'm interpreting this as comparing Laverne Cox to her character, not comparing Laverne Cox to Titus, right? Because that's a different and I think significantly more problematic thing. But I think it could be very, very helpful in a lot of ways, just to see like how people are sort of like how aware people are of how much they need to change their language, depending on whether they're in character or not. But I think there's also just like a sort of grain of salt that you have to think about, is that like, I guess the way actors think about language is probably going to be a little bit different than just like non-actors thinking about language. I guess like an example is that I used to sing, and so the way I think about language and singing is probably different from people who weren't like trained in singing. But I do think it would be really interesting to see like what sort of stereotypes and ideologies hold up, because the actors are going to be pulling from those, the directors are going to be pulling from those. And so you get like this really, like nice environment where everything, it's not like controlled in the sense of an experiment would be, but it's controlled in that you have like a written script and you have everything filmed and done in like really nice audio situations. So I guess like the shorter version of that is, I think it would be a really cool thing to look at. It's not something I've thought about looking at, but I think it really should be considered.
Thank you. Bryce, it looks like you just got hearts. So take that as you will, but that does leave us time for some final comments. So maybe we can go in reverse order. Bryce, would you like to provide some final comments on your talk and the panel?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I want to echo, well, maybe a parallel perspective to something that Lal mentioned earlier, in that I think that in many ways, I see a sort of like queer folk linguistic approach as a queering of folk linguistics, not a folk linguistics for queer people, but also that queer folk linguistics is not supposed to replace queer linguistics, translinguistics, ratiolinguistics. It's not meant to do any of those things. Rather, I see it as sort of a set of ways of looking at language at non-linguist ideas about language that ought to be pulling from a lot of different things that we know and a lot of different perspectives that are really important. And so in the theme of a queered science of language, I think that in one way, of course, it addresses systems of power, namely between linguists and non-linguists. But in lots of ways, it also, I think, readdresses I don't know, the rigidity with which we need to work within a frame. I mean, I think that individual communities, depending on what place they're in and who the people are who constitute those communities, are going to have different ethical needs in terms of research, and also different lenses in terms of what you're looking at for that research. So I still hold that I think that a queer folk linguistics is kind of a really fun and cool thing to be doing, but that it's certainly not fully developed yet. But that I rely on my colleagues and mentors to help me and contribute to it getting there. There's my final comment.
Thank you. Dominique?
I guess sort of going off of that, I think the idea that we should sort of consider non-linguist ideas about language is like, it's a really good point, because a lot of the conversations I've had about queer linguistics a lot of the really good ones have come from people who have no idea what linguistics is, because they're living this and they're having to put all of the stuff we're trying to theorize about into practice. And I think sort of recentering who's in control of explaining what is happening in queer language is something to like consider and keep in mind. And I think my sort of biggest point that I didn't make in my talk that I probably should have is that I think we should be more open to looking at fields outside of linguistics, in trying to understand queer linguistics. So like, I'm in the middle of my dissertation prospectus right now, so I'm like reading a bunch, and a lot of the most helpful stuff I found is stuff that I've found outside of linguistics. So like Crenshaw, of course, but I've also seen a lot of things in queer theory that have been helpful. And I think there should be a little bit more interaction between linguistics, sociolinguistics, and other fields, because I think we get a little wrapped up in like being linguistics. So yeah.
Yes, thank you. Final comments?
Yeah, I guess I just want to encourage people who might be thinking about working with trans communities to reach out to trans colleagues and to work with trans students. I think it's so important. I mean, I was just talking to a research team of mine with entirely trans members about how hard it is for us to figure out like how to code gender identity. So, you know, if the people who are like deeply engaged with this are like, oh man, this is so hard, it should be just as hard for all of us, right? It should require a lot of thought. And often it will require going to someone who has that lived experience and has that degree of kind of intuitive knowledge that comes from that to be able to fully assess the implications of the work that we're doing. So I would just encourage people to especially reach out to trans students. Trans youth tend to be really interested in language. And I think there's a lot that we can be doing to bring trans folks into linguistics that is not really happening yet on a major scale. And I'll also just say I invite people to reach out to me if you're interested in this topic, especially if you are maybe a trans student who's interested in working on this. Maybe you don't have the support you need locally. Please just get in contact with me. I'm always happy to talk about translinguistic subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, Lal. And I would like just to provide a final comment related to my talk. Even with just, you know, these three panelists here, you can see that there's a lot of interesting work going on in these areas, especially advancing research on queer and trans people's usage of language. But for us as a discipline of linguists, it's not enough to make space for queer language science, but also we need to queer the science of language and the way we undertake that science, not just in our formulation of scientific frameworks, but in the spaces that we carve out and force into existence in our administrative and financial disciplinary institutions. Whether that's, as with Aberlin, inviting us and making or designating this time for us to have a panel, or working to develop even small financial travel grants to major conferences specifically for LGBTQ people. Queering a science of language means more than just doing queer language science. There were a few comments asking about the panel slides. The Committee on LGBTQ Issues in Linguistics at the LSA will host those slides on our website, so you can find them there. Otherwise, thank you for your time and for joining us today.